Methods, experiments, part 1 of 2. Experiments. Generally speaking, experiments are associated with the scientific, positivist research. They are, however, also used within interpretivist research also. The key is that positivists and interpretivists use different types of experiments. Artificial/laboratory experiments. These are used by positivists who prefer reliable, value-free, objective, structured, formal, quantitative research methods and data. Natural/field experiments. These are used by interpretivists who prefer valid, value-laden, subjective, unstructured, informal, qualitative research methods and data. Artificial/laboratory experiments. Scientific method preferred by positivists allows a researcher to test a hypothesis by looking for causal relationships between variables, correlations, e.g., relationship between social class and education. They aim to uncover predictable, formulaic laws of human behavior. Conducted in an artificial environment, a laboratory, so that all variables can be controlled. They follow a hypothetico-deductive method, scientific method. The hypothetico-deductive method. Positivists claim that by following this method, all researchers are able to create truly value-free, objective scientific research. A phenomena is observed. A hypothesis is formulated. An experiment is set up to test the hypothesis. Control group/experimental group. Key variables are controlled and changed one at a time. Effects of variable changes are observed and noted. Data is collected, organized, and quantified. Conclusions are drawn, objective. Hypothesis is accepted or rejected. A theory is formalized. Other researchers scrutinize the theory. Key aspects of an artificial/laboratory experiment. There always has to be a control group and experiment group so that comparisons can be made and variables tested. Control group will have no changes made to it. It will be used to compare any changes that occur within the experimental group. In the experimental group, key variables will be manipulated one at a time within this group to see if any of them make a difference to the group's behavior. The control group can be looked at to see what normal behavior should be. Control and replication. Within an experiment, researchers must try and control all the variables and only manipulate the variables that they want to. This way, they can be sure of cause and effect. If this is done correctly, then the experiment, when repeated, should be replicable, i.e., repeatable and therefore reliable. So, what are these variables that keep being mentioned? There are many types of variables that you need to know about. Variables, in general, are any factor that can change or vary, e.g., age, gender, ethnicity, ability, temperature, lighting, environment. Positivists aim to uncover correlations between variables, e.g., how age affects IQ. These can be broken down into controlled variables and extraneous variables. These are the variables that the researcher has control over, and extraneous variables are the variables that the researcher has no control over and could ultimately affect the outcome of the experiment, e.g., subject variables. Experimental variables are the variables being studied, e.g., age and IQ. These are broken down into two sub-variables, independent variable and dependent variable. These are the variables that are changed, e.g., we could use different age groups in an experiment. The dependent variable is the outcome that occurs when the independent variable is changed, e.g., ability, dependent variable, might change according to the different age groups being tested, which is the independent variable. The experimenter will keep changing the independent variable until the dependent variable changes. To summarize variables then, variables in general, controlled variables, extraneous variables, subject variables, experimental variables, and independent variables, and finally dependent variables. Advantages of artificial/laboratory experiments. Scientific method, prestige and funding. Value-free, objective. Quantifiable data. High in reliability method and data. Allows for correlations in the data to be made easily. Uncovers formulaic laws of human behavior. Disadvantages of artificial/laboratory experiments. Remember to evaluate the methods by looking at the practical, ethical, and theoretical limitations of the method, PET. So, disadvantages. Cannot control all the variables when dealing with society and individuals. Volunteer bias. Invalidity. Consent. Cost. Time. Experimenter bias. Small scale, unrepresentative. Are people passive? Artificial setting. Elton Mayo, 1927, The Hawthorne Effect. Asked to conduct an experiment by the Hawthorne Electricity Works to see if lighting conditions affected staff productivity, Mayo found that if the subject's staff changed their behaviour simply because they were being studied. Stanley Milgram, 1963, Obedience Experiment. Inspired by Nazi war crimes during World War II, Milgram wanted to find out if people were willing to follow orders from authority figures, even when the orders were morally wrong. His electric shock experiments deceived the participants by suggesting that there would be no long-term adverse psychological effects. The critics were not so sure. Philip Zimbardo, 1961, the Stanford Prison Experiment. Zimbardo wanted to explore the darker side of human nature by seeing how far people would conform to roles given to them. In his famous prison experiment, things got out when participants began to psychologically abuse each other. On the second day, there was a prison riot, and after 6 days, the experiment was stopped.